Good morning. Welcome to a new study in Leviticus. Today, our plan is to look at Leviticus 2 and 3. So, chapter 2 and 3, we're going to look at two more offerings. Last week, as you know, we started with the burnt offering. The burnt offering was us coming to the tabernacle, going inside, and at the very beginning, simply saying, "We know we don't belong here. We're common. We're of the earth. You, Yahweh, are holy. You're unlike us. We don't want to be consumed by you. We don't want to die. We don't want a plague to come upon our people. But we do want to spend time with you. We want to have access to you. We want to pray to you." And so we looked at that burnt offering, which was simply just an offering to be in and enjoy the presence of Yahweh. It wasn't about sin. It wasn't a sin offering. And by the way, neither are these next two offerings. So today, again, in chapters 2 and 3, we'll look at the grain offering and then the peace offering. The grain offering and the peace offering, and the next week our plan will be to move on into these other sin offerings. So for today, chapters 2 and 3 in Leviticus, let's look first at chapter 2, the grain offering. Now, what was the purpose for the grain offering? Well, the purpose of the grain offering, you bringing grain, or maybe even baked into a cake or bread, you bringing in the grain was to honor Yahweh as the source of life and fertility. So you would have a plot of land, you would have some space where you're growing your own food, and you would take that grain, the first fruits of it, the first of the harvest, the best of it, you would take that, bring it to the tabernacle, and after going through the burnt offering, you would bring your grain offering. And the whole purpose was to honor Yahweh as the source of life and fertility. The reason my family is able to even eat bread or eat any of the food that we have is because you've given it to us, Yahweh. You're the one that gives us life. So God is the one that gives us this life, keeps us alive, and so we take the first of it, the best of it, and say, "Here, I'm returning it to you." That's the grain offering, the purpose of it. It was an offering, as I said, of first fruits. It would be the first of the harvest that you would give to God. And again, it was also the best that you would give. You wouldn't just grow your food, take the food, harvest the food, feed your family, and say, "If we have any left, we'll give it to God." No, you would immediately give to God. And even in that, there's a little bit of faith, right? We're going to give this to God, and what if the rest of the crop doesn't grow like it should? Well, you were trusting God because, after all, God was the life giver. He's the one that supplied you with the things that you needed. So that's the purpose of the grain offering, and what you would do. You'd bring the first fruits of the grain offering. In verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2, we see that a handful was given to God. That you'd bring in this grain offering, a handful of it was taken, burnt on the altar, and given to God. Let's read verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2. "When anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. And he shall take from it a handful of fine flour and oil with all of its frankincense. And the priest shall burn this as its memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the Lord's food offerings." So here's what would happen. You would bring this grain, and later on we'll see in verses 4 and following that you could have even baked it into bread. You can bring it before it was baked or cooked or after. But you would bring this grain offering, and a handful would be taken. There would be oil and frankincense put on it, and it would be burned on the altar. And that was the memorial portion to God. God, you've given us the things that we need. And then the rest was not taken home with you. You wouldn't walk out with a loaf of bread. The rest was given to the priests. The priests would eat it. This is how the priests fed their families and ate their food. They didn't have the plots of land that you have. The priests of the tribe of Levi, they would eat based on what you have, based on what you bring in. So they would get their income, so to speak, because they're doing this tabernacle work. They would get it from your resources. You'd first give it to God, then they'd take the rest and they'd feed their families with it. We see a parallel here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul talks about the minister of the gospel being being a person who receives his income from the work of the gospel. So the one who labors in preaching and teaching, the other people who benefit from that come and bring their offerings to God. They're bringing them to God, but then the minister of the gospel gets a portion of that to feed his family and to continue on. Well, you can trace that all the way back to here and the grain offering. So you bring the first fruits. It's meant as a sign of thanksgiving, as it were, and a recognition that God is the source of your life. He's the source of your food. He's keeping you alive. And that's what the grain offering was. Later, as we go on through chapter 2, you basically just see that verses 4 through 10 are how to bring this grain offering when it's cooked. Again, you could bring it without being cooked, or you could bring it while it was cooked. And then verses 11 through 16 are really the conclusion, kind of the appendix, some concluding thoughts. This is what you do, some concluding thoughts. Now, why salt? In these concluding thoughts, in verse 13, you see this, you read this. You shall season all of your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant of your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So why would there be salt put on these offerings? Well, everything tastes better with salt. That's not why. Salt is a preservative. So God refers to his covenant at Sinai. This is in the book of Numbers later on. He refers to his covenant at Sinai and later on his covenant with David as covenants of salt. So these two different covenants with God's people, the covenant at Sinai, the covenant with David, he refers to them as covenants of salt. So why does he call them covenants of salt? Why does he tell the offerer to put salt on this grain offering? Well, salt was a preservative, is a preservative. Salt keeps things. So it's a sign to show this covenant will go on. Nothing can harm this covenant. This covenant can't be broken. Fire can't change this covenant. Salt will preserve this covenant. This is God showing the worshiper, hey, put salt on it, because remember, you and I are in this together forever. I've committed myself to you. You've committed yourself to me. So that's what salt signifies. So that's why salt would be used on these offerings. It was a way to show these people, this isn't just something I do for a few months and then I might kind of walk away from Yahweh, or he might walk away from me. No, we're in this together. He's going to provide for me. I'm going to continue thanking him and offering my life to him, my goods to him. I am his and he is mine. And salt is the sign of preserving that. This covenant between us goes on forever. Some takeaways from our view of the grain offering. Well, let's consider John 6:31. I put it here on the screen. Let's think of John 6:31. The crowd talking to Jesus, this is in the time of Jesus, the crowd is talking to Jesus, and they say this about their forefathers who lived back in the Levitical time period. Here's what they say. Our fathers ate manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God, the bread from God, is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They said to him, Sir, give us this bread always. We'd like to always have food. We'd like to never run out, never have a famine. Sir, give us this bread always. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Jesus is teaching, hey, back in Leviticus, you used to be grateful for the bread that God gave you. It happened under the time of Moses. God continually fed you. God has given you eternal bread. Whoa, we want eternal bread. I'm eternal bread. That's what Jesus was saying. So back in Leviticus, the worshiper would remember God has given us the food we need, and they would offer the first fruits to God. Today we realize God has given us the eternal nourishment we need. God has given us life. Who is that life? What is that life? Is it bread? Is it something to eat? No, it's Jesus Christ himself. He's the bread of life. So Jesus is our life and our nourishment from a generous God. God's character has not changed. He fed his people then, and he feeds his people now. And ultimately, he feeds us with his Son, Jesus Christ. Another takeaway. These people, as I said, would give their best, the first fruits, back to God. Consider Romans 12:1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers. So I appeal to you because of what I've just been telling you in these 11 chapters about how God is Savior and he is ruling this world and bringing salvation for his people. Therefore, I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So we give all of ourselves as living sacrifices back to God. He's given his Son, and his Son being a sacrifice to us. And so what's the logical thing to do in return? We're entirely yours as well. Not to earn anything from God. We've already been given by God freely his salvation. We don't earn salvation. But our lives given back to him are ways to say thank you, to worship him. You've given me life, I'm giving you my life. That's the idea. And you can trace that theme, that idea, all the way back to this grain offering in Leviticus. So, we come into the tabernacle, we give a burnt offering, we want to enjoy your presence without dying, without having a plague brought upon us. We just want to be with you, Yahweh. We're bringing this burnt offering. And oh, by the way, you give me life. You give our family life. You've given us food. We're offering this to you. Priests, you have some so you can feed your family. And then we come to the next offering in chapter 3, the peace offering. The peace offering. What's the purpose of the peace offering? It's an offering to enjoy fellowship with Yahweh. So to enjoy fellowship is the key here. Some people call the peace offering the fellowship offering, and that makes sense. That's a good way of saying it. But it's the idea that we're bringing this offering and we're fellowshipping with God. So burnt offering, we want to be in your presence without dying. And then the grain offering, we are giving a sign that shows we know that this comes from your generous hand. The peace offering kind of advances that all the more, where you would literally sit down and start eating. And the idea was that you were eating with Yahweh. You were fellowshipping with him. So the meaning of the offering, actually the wording of the offering, the meaning of the offering is related to the word shalom. You might have heard that term before, that Hebrew term. Shalom meaning wholeness or peace. You have all that you need. You can be at rest. So the peace offering, the meaning of the term peace offering is derived from the word shalom. You've got this kind of, I'm with Yahweh. He's with me. I'm actually eating with him, and he's not destroying me. He's my friend. He's with me. We have a relationship together. That's the peace offering. So this chapter 3, tells us in verse 1, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offers an animal from the herd, male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. This offering, just like the burnt offering, is an offering of an animal without blemish. And it was often that it would be an animal from the herd or cattle, maybe a cow. Okay. Also, you see that a lamb could be offered in verse 6. A lamb could be offered. You also see in verse 12 a goat could be offered. Now, why those things? Why not grain? Because you would eat the meat. You would eat the animal. This would be literally a barbecue that you would enjoy with Yahweh. That's what this is. So in verse 1, it's cattle. Verse 6, it could be a lamb. Verse 12, it could be a goat. It could be a number of different animals. It was offered to God. So first and foremost, a portion of this animal was offered to God. So it would kind of be like God's portion of the meal. He would get to eat. Now, of course, we know that God doesn't need us to cook him dinner. It was just a sign to show you're going to eat with me, I'm going to eat with you. We're enjoying this meal together. A portion was also given to the priests. And in chapter 7, Leviticus 7, which we'll get to later, in Leviticus 7 we learn that the worshiper always ate. So three guests at this table. You, the worshiper, the priests would sit down with you for this meal, and Yahweh himself was thought to be eating this meal with you, enjoying this fellowship with you. That's what the peace offering was. Now, in the ancient Near East, you might be familiar with this, hospitality was huge. And so to welcome somebody to your abode, your dwelling as a host, was a way to show peace between you and the person coming. And what would you do when they got to your house? You would prepare a meal and you would eat with them. So it would be the host graciously extending an invitation for you to come and eat. And as we're eating together, it's a sign that we have peace with one another. Now it's interesting to note. Listen to Psalm 23, verse 5. The famous Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Listen to these words. You prepare, so speaking to Yahweh, Yahweh, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. So the idea is Yahweh inviting you to his house, you're sitting down, and oh, by the way, life is still hard. You've got enemies all around you, and this says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I mean, I've got challenges and things and people trying to destroy me and other nations coming after us. We've got all of this all around us, but Yahweh is saying, sit down and eat. You are at peace with me. There's nothing to worry about. And oh, by the way, he doesn't just give you a little bit of crumbs. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. I have all I need. There's a restaurant that I used to love to go to in downtown Los Angeles called Langer's Deli. Langer's Deli had the best pastrami sandwiches. They're famous. And they also had unlimited refills of cream soda. They would bring you this giant cup of cream soda if you ordered it. They didn't bring it to everyone, but I would always order it. This giant cup of cream soda, and when you're done, they'd bring more. When you're done with that, they'd bring more. And so you'd enjoy your sandwich. You'd have your cup overflowing, as it were. Now imagine eating that meal and enjoying it, and your greatest enemies are all around you. The threat of job loss, temptation, all sorts of things all around you, or someone actually trying to do you harm. And it's as if God were saying, sit down at the table. I'm eating with you. Yes, your enemies are all around, but look at me. I'm here. You've got peace with me. That's all that matters. That's the idea. The peace offering is, listen, as we're later on going to be in the promised land, and there might be people who hate us because we took their land. There might be enemies all around us. We're having a meal with Yahweh, and he doesn't have a meal with just anybody. He's our God. We're his people. We're fellowshipping together. That's the idea of the peace offering. What's amazing is that we can eat in the presence of our God, who is a consuming fire. He's holy, he's just, he cannot be in the presence of sin, but because we've come to him in this appropriate way on his terms, he is fellowshipping with us. This is an amazing grace that we receive. Some takeaways regarding the peace offering. Consider Romans 5:1. Therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have, here's our word, peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. You could say this, Jesus is our peace offering. Jesus laid down his life, and what do we have with God the Father? Peace. So we have a faith that we have peace with God through Jesus Christ. So we trust Jesus. You are the one that gives us peace with God. We are right with God. We can be in his presence without fear because of what you've done, Jesus Christ. That's Romans 5:1. Now it's interesting. There's an interesting parallel here, and I can't, just for time's sake, I told you about Psalm 23. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Just because we have peace with God doesn't mean that all threats go away. We still live in this cursed world. There's still difficulties and challenges and enemies. That's why later on, like right after these verses in Romans 5, it says that we have this peace with God, and oh, by the way, trials are going to come. And we can endure these trials, and these trials produce character and hope. So the idea is, just because you have peace with God, it doesn't mean that all the trials go away. But we can endure because God has given us, Romans 5, a little bit later, his Holy Spirit. He's poured out his love for us and given us his Spirit. What is his Spirit? His presence. So we can go through difficult trials, whether it's enemies in Psalm 23 or unstated trials, but but there are challenges that we're going through in Psalm 5 or Romans 5. We can go through all of those, all the while knowing we have peace with God, and that's what matters. Very fascinating. Peace with God, and even this idea of the peace offering doesn't happen with all the enemies of God completely and forever vanquished. It happens even when there are threats around us. We can have peace and fellowship with God. Another takeaway. Leviticus 3 verse 5 says this, "Then Aaron's sons shall burn it," the peace offering, "on the altar on top of the burnt offering, which is on the wood of the fire. It is a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord," a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Yahweh loves the peace offering. He loves when you bring the peace offering. What can we conclude with that? Yahweh loves to be in fellowship with his people. Yahweh desires to be in fellowship with his people. Leviticus 3:5 is an important statement. When you understand what the peace offering is, we're sharing a meal with Yahweh. We're friends with Yahweh. We're at peace with Yahweh. And you understand Leviticus 3:5, it says that that is a pleasing aroma to him. He loves to be with his people. Yahweh is not some God with his arm folded frowning at his people. He's got a generous heart. He loves to be with his people, and he's given a peace offering as a way to demonstrate that. Listen to Matthew 26:29. Jesus, in the upper room, the night before he's going to die, sharing this Passover meal, which he institutes as the Lord's Supper, sharing this meal with his disciples. Now consider the disciples. Even that night, even at that meal, he's sharing this meal, and they're arguing about which one's the greatest. He's saying, "You're going to leave me." And Peter's saying, "I won't leave you." So there's pride and arrogance all over that meal, but Jesus has committed himself to these men whom he loves. And he even gives this meal to the church to communicate to the church, this is a meal that I'm giving, I'm sharing with you because I love you. You've been forgiven in me. I'm giving myself to you. Listen to Matthew 26:29. He gives that meal. He gives us the Lord's Supper, and it says this, "I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of this vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Jesus is saying, men, this is the last time we're going to have this type of meal together on earth. But one day, I'm going to drink of the fruit of this vine with you again in my Father's kingdom. And we know that we're going to enjoy that as well as followers of Christ. Christ will one day eat physically and eat peacefully with us. Now imagine that. Imagine being the Old Testament worshiper in Leviticus and bringing this peace offering. You know what that meant. Yahweh, his presence is with us. But you wouldn't be sitting at a table with you, the priests, and another man who is God. You would just understand there's a cloud here. I understand that the glory of God is in this place, and that is so amazing, so special. We're actually going to have a man sitting with us, this man who is God, Jesus Christ himself, and we're going to be eating that peace offering, that meal as it were, that meal of peace, that meal of shalom with him in the new heavens and the new earth. That is literally and physically going to happen. So we see the shadows of that, the hints of that back in Leviticus 3. What do we learn about our God? He loves to be with his people. He loves to be at peace with his people. And he wants them to sit and enjoy the peace with him, even if enemies might be around them for a time, because they are right with him. They're at peace with him. One day, he'll be physically present, eating with us. There will be no more enemies, and that will be a meal to enjoy. Well, I hope you've been helped by this explanation of the grain offerings and the peace offerings. Next week, we'll get into more of the sin offerings and the offerings given because men and women sin. So again, hope that's helpful to you. Stay tuned next week.